Finally, it rises.
Hey, it's ODB, the Lincoln Addict. We're going to jump right into this 64 Lincoln Continental Convertible that's sold in the past. You can see here on the screen that Bring a Trailer has listed or labeled it rather as alumni. So it has sold prior. We'll look at that. There's a lot to talk about. There is a couple of folks that have given some feedback that this may not be the LBJ or the car that was on the tarmac when JFK's coffin was being loaded on to Air Force One. So I'll reinforce where I got that information from, and we'll look through it a little bit more. Now, the reason why I say that is you may recall, if you're a Lincoln Addict podcast listener, that on episode 27, I did an episode about this very car, LBJ 64, and I recently shared the link to that on this Bring a Trailer auction, and that prompted someone to chime in. Someone also chimed in recently, so we'll get to that. But this 64 has not sold just once. Well, it sold once on Bring a Trailer, but it also sold via Christie's in the past, and we'll talk about that amount as well. But basically, this car, ironically enough, it was November 16th of 2022, which was just a year shy of the 60th anniversary of JFK's assassination on 11/22 of 63. Basically, this car sold for $172,000. Now, thinking back, I may have done a review on this one, or I may have just did the podcast episode. I can't really remember, but really, where I want to focus the attention is on this new listing, and there's some very, very nice professional photos. Also, they do have this as a premium listing, which is the first time I'm seeing that. And of course, I mentioned alumni. This car undoubtedly was LBJ. So Lyndon Baines Johnson. He lived in Central Texas on his ranch, and you're going to see photos of that. Basically, this car sold, and for whatever reason, the person is looking to potentially cash in on it, or maybe they've had their fun with it for just over a year now, about a year and a half. They talk about some of the history here with the Elwood Ingle design. Fourth generation Continental underwent a mid-cycle refresh. So Elwood Ingle, the 61s, famously were designed by him. By the time we get to 64, it's, he's moved on. I think he's at that point, he's at Chrysler. And, these cars, history tells us they were redesigned in 64. Some like the 64s more than the earlier years, and vice versa. That's just really kind of a preference type thing. There's a lot of basic information here. There is a removable magnet indicating President Johnson's ownership will accompany the car, so we'll see some of that. One thing to point out that's key on this car is the interior color, and I think that's going to maybe help us with the mystery of, was this the car that was on the tarmac that fateful day on November 22nd, 63? And I've looked at a few more photos, so we're going to look at that, I promise, here in just a few moments. When I look at this car, I see a car that looks really, 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 really nice. On the podcast, I talked a lot about how this car was restored. They mentioned at the beginning it having restoration, I think, in the early 2000s. But there is some history on this one we'll talk about. What I want to do now, though, is jump over to what I put together here and just kind of go through this here. So we know in 64, if we take a look here, there's 3,328 of the convertibles built. This was a screenshot just from a little while ago via Haggerty. We see the price, anywhere from $24,600 all the way just north of $100. The key thing here, obviously, this car has lineage to a former president, and that is obviously going to elevate the price. Hence why it sold for $172,000, as you can see right here, as I mentioned about a year and a half ago. It was added to the Lincoln Registry back in 2017. And we can see here the normal stuff I typically will cover with some of these more in-depth reviews is if we look at the VIN number, which I have pasted up here, the number 4 is for the year, so 64. Y is the assembly plant. These were all built in Wixom. 86 is the four-door convertible number. The letter N is the Mercury Edsel Lincoln 430. The 4 is the standard number and the consecutive unit number. And in this case, the 00 is, indicating it's an early production. But basically, this is the 405th. So if you look down here, you basically have 405th built for that model year. There were 36,297 units built for 64. That's not including the 15 limos, so I didn't tally that one or that number there. The VIN plate decoded, we can see here, again, Bring a Trailer does this on their site, which I love, but the 74A is the four-door convertible. M, as Bring a Trailer pointed out, that is the Arctic White. You have the trim 74 beige. That's a key thing that I think is going to come into play with some of the information I've received since I've done the podcast. Date is 09J, so we'll look at that on the next slide. The district code, or I always say DSO, is the acronym there, Destination Sales Office. Sometimes I'll say 22, which is Dallas. That ties into paperwork that comes with the car. And of course, the other stuff, the number 1 and the number 4, that's pretty standard. 09J, this might have been the earliest number that I've personally seen. But basically, in my little grid here, we know that the letter I is skipped because it could be confused as a 1. So if you just look at the basics here, the date is 09. That's the 9th day of the month. The J, if we look at this, is September. So that would have been September 9th of 1963 for the 64 model year. Remember, they start building these mid-year to get ready for that 64-year rollout. Basically, it was the 405th out of 36,312. That includes the limos. Production ran from late August 64. So August 3rd of 64 to July 9th of 65. Actually, I didn't update this bullet point, so that's my apologies. What that should state there is, if we go back to the grid, some of this information I've been able to find over the course of time, but the 64 model year production started on August 12th of 63, and being that this was built just under 30 days later, to me it's always interesting to know, like, wow, in that just under 30-day period, they were only on the 405th built out of 36,000. So, kind of slowly ramping up, I guess you can kind of say there. Now, the pros of this listing, we're going to go back to the photos here in just a moment. Bottom line is there's history with it. Anytime there's history with, a former president, to me, it's going to elevate the status. You're going to have potentially a museum, a collector, maybe a family member, a library of, maybe, when I say a library, like maybe there's lineage to said individual and they're willing to buy it and place it into, some place where people can see it and whatnot. It was restored. The only key call out that I can really reinforce to everyone is it does have a two-port fuel pump, which I know is being very, very minor. But if we look here at this photo, which, by the way, is a nice photo looking down at the engine, we can see here the 2 screws, and that indicates that it is a 2-port, not a 3-port. Now, I know some people go, hey, what's the big deal? Typically, folks will tell you in the Lincoln community, you'll start to have vapor lock more often with a couple of these scenarios. This one has the heat shield on it, which is great. It has the insulation, which is fantastic as well. But I'm of the mindset, if it's not broke, don't fix it. But certainly, if this was my car, I would want to have the 3-port. You're looking at a few $100, upwards of $500 if you don't have a good core. Typically, I don't think they'll accept a core of the 2-port because most people don't want those. Very, very minor in the grand scheme of things. Now, underneath this car, as you would imagine with the restoration that's underwent, is a lot of stuff is nice and tidy. The leaf springs are painted. The rear end is cleaned and painted. Underneath this car is pretty much all painted. This car wouldn't have looked that good from the factory, but certainly someone has taken some time with it. Some of these photos we did see prior with the listing, so this is kind of a cool one next to an airplane. We have the VIN information here, which we've pretty much already broken down. It has a Montana title. Folks will tell you, and you can kind of look into that a lot of folks will title different vehicles in Montana for tax reasons. Now, I'm going to go through some of these photos. There are some markings throughout on the car, and I don't know the exact meaning of most of them. Some of them are just markings that I think during the restoration, which is kind of ironic. But to me, this car looks really, really good from the photos. I would imagine any person that's going to put out, right now it's at $80,000, any person that's going to purchase this car isn't going to probably do much other than either let it sit as an investment or potentially drive it some, maybe as a parade car, things like that. But you can see they did it like really over the top photo shoot on this. And that's what I would suggest. If somebody has a high dollar item like this, you want to put the time and effort to have it clean, to have it look very presentable. And, the better this car is presented, the more money it's going to bring. If we take a look at some of the gapping here, it looks really, really good. And again, as you can imagine with a restoration, a lot of these things, should be kind of dialed in as long as someone knew what they were doing. Again, a lot of detailed photos, which is awesome. Roy Butler Austin, that will tie into some of the paperwork that we'll see in just a moment. Has the original style headlights, which is fantastic. You can see the squares on these. They look really, really good. Probably redone. Certainly, if LBJ really did drive this car, which we understand on his ranch a lot and things like that, some of the previous articles reinforce that, the car kind of underwent an extensive restoration. We could see here, again, a key call out is the interior. I love the look of this interior. It looks way better than most, but, with those little cracks and things like that, it just kind of shows you the authenticity of this car. It's hard to tell if the carpet, I want to say this carpet is not factory carpet. I would assume that it was changed at some point. It's kind of an odd color, but some of you guys can maybe chime in to let me know what you think. It's kind of hard to see, but for some reason it just doesn't look factory to me. Maybe it is. This does look like a factory floor mat. These were reproduced, but that one does look like an original to me, based upon what I've seen. Certainly, if this is factory, this does look sun faded, or the lower carpets on the door panels. It doesn't look perfect, but certainly that can be remedied. What we see in the trunk is something that looks very, very nice. These pieces are painted very nicely. You've got the little mounts where the top kind of sits. You've got what's often referred to as the toilet seat, unfortunately, which is above the spare tire. We are missing that bar that really should be installed in here, and that's a key thing I'll talk more about in the future, but John Cashman really reinforces it. In 64 and 65, even with this car, I would easily put that bar in here. It's super simple. I have a video on my channel. The reason for that is over time, these cast pieces can crack. I actually was just at somebody's place and I mentioned that. And the next day he texted me and said, "Hey, I'm working on the car. And look what happened. The cast piece broke and it snapped on the ram. The whole end broke off." So I can say that I've seen it happen, and it, to find these pieces is getting more expensive. So basically that bar just goes on that little knuckle. Typically on this one is where I install it. But yeah, something that's going to take you 15 minutes to do, even on this car, I would do it. Unless you plan to never mess with the top, and I wouldn't suggest that. The engine bay looks very, very good. Everything is kind of painted that flat black, that real clean look. It does still have the single reservoir. I often am someone that would say, hey, swap it out. But if a car with a history like this one, you're probably not going to drive it too much. We could see some discoloration up underneath here. I think this is just maybe post-restoration. It looks like, maybe they just didn't get up in that area. But again, typically you're not going to see the bottom of these cars all white like that. It looks like at some point they did strip the undercoating off of it. If I could see this car in person, I would kind of investigate it more. But I mean, certainly, underneath here, it looks like these are just kind of like maybe some water spots and things like that. But I would say that this car is probably pretty solid. I would still want to see it in person, especially if I was going to spend that kind of money. Imagine someone taking one day off of work and flying into town to see it. It's going to be a lot less expensive than buying something that you have come to the realization you just don't want. Okay, there's a ton of paperwork that comes with this thing. Here is where we see Roy Butler Inc. We can see the delivery date was 10/3 of 63, so that was before the JFK assassination, which was on 11/22 of 63. Here's some additional information, and I want to jump back to the presentation in a moment. Here's a key call out that someone has mentioned, that if you look at this car and you look at the interior color, that's going to be a little bit of a tell potentially to me if this was really the car that was on the tarmac. We can see restoration photos here, and that is fantastic. There is one photo, and it's hard to tell. I want to say this might be McNamara, possibly. I could be wrong, but in this photo with the top up, it is kind of, this interior does look darker. Now, I do believe it's because the top is up, but let's not forget there is a window in the back of this, okay? So I know some folks have chimed in on this, which we're going to talk about in a moment, but again, this photo, it does look a little bit dark back here. It makes the interior look darker, if that makes sense. So here's the key thing that we need to hone in on here in the next few minutes so I can wrap this video up. So the bonus part of this video is, since I did the podcast, I've had people chime in to say the LBJ car that we just looked at is not this car, okay, that this is a different car. And if you look at this gentleman's comment, he says, are you suggesting that the Continental Convertible in the casket photo is the same as the LBJ-owned convertible? If so, you are misinformed. The car was obtained from a local Lincoln Mercury dealership for the motorcade, then returned at the end of the day. The Lincoln was silver with black interior, and it is seen in several motorcades. We're going to look at a few photos. Another gentleman chimed in on a post, and I could not find it. I thought I took a screenshot, and he mentioned a very similar thing. He said it's kind of hard to find color photos and video from that day, that fateful day, but he mentioned that the car, he was pretty certain it was not the same car. So I may stand corrected on this, but I'm going to show you where I got the information. This is a very sad photo. I took a photo of this photo at Dealey Plaza, the 6th floor museum, and we can see Jackie O right here. Someone also had chimed in on a past post, and they mentioned, I think, that they had to take off the handles to get it through the door, which is just so sad. Let's look a little bit further. So I mentioned I did the podcast in the past, and I mentioned, based upon information I read, that was the LBJ car. It may not be. Okay, Continental comments, May, June 2000. I do have this linked over to, I had found a scanned, and it's actually July, August. I think they may have done a couple. Here I put May, June 2000. I didn't pull that issue. I pulled this issue, July, August 99, and I pulled a second quarter of 83 that I own. And they talk about in this particular issue right here. So we're gonna talk about this in just a moment. This is what I covered on the podcast. But Nick Krajes, I forget. You'll see I have it listed here on the pronunciation of it. But Christie's sold this car in August 05 for $94,000. It was estimated to bring $40 to $60K. Quote, the car we offer for sale was the 405th built in September 63. As a 64 model, upon completion, it was shipped to Dallas, Texas, and bought new by the former president of the U.S. That's what we see from the paperwork early October, of course. President Johnson enjoyed being behind the wheel of this automobile, or of his automobiles, rather, and quite a few stories exist of him giving tours on his ranch in the convertible at dizzying speeds, so on and so forth. Now, we're going to talk about these two photos here in just a moment. Now, this is some of what I had collected for the podcast. It says ownership subsequently passed through several owners before ending up with Nick. He was an Austin-based lobbyist. Apparently, the car had been to several shops until I think it's Crawl Jays is how I had typed it out. CRAWL dash J's is like the pronunciation. But it had been to several shops until he commissioned Jeff's Resurrections of Austin, Texas, to complete a restoration in the mid-90s. Okay. Nearly 2 years later, the car was ready and debuted as one of the special guests at the Lincoln Motor Car Company's 75th anniversary. That was part of the Christie's write-up I was able to find. That's a direct quote. Now, Continental Comments did a write-up on the subject for their July-August 99 issue. That's where the issue comes into play, where they provided further details about the car in the section titled, what you see there, the 64 Lincoln Continental Convertible, the LBJ car. Now, this is possibly where the misinformation comes from, but I wanted folks to see that I didn't just make this up. They interviewed Jeff Snyder, who did the restoration on the car. The Continental Comments: how did Nick happen to acquire the LBJ Lincoln? Snyder: the car is a very early 64, which is true. We have magazine articles from one of the weekly magazines where the Lincoln's sitting on the tarmac where they're putting Kennedy's coffin into Air Force One after he was assassinated. So LBJ had this car before Kennedy was shot, which is a true statement. Nick found out through a banker that the car was for sale. The LBJ company owned the car, and it was sold to an individual. The individual needed to sell it for whatever reason, and the banker friend of Nick's found out about it. That was in the late 70s and early 80s. Based upon the above information, the car you see here was, so we know it was Lyndon Johnson's. Again, the gentleman that made this comment and someone else, and I apologize, I could not find the screenshot that I took, both had suggested that, hey, Jason, that information is not correct. So I'm a type of person, if I make a mistake, I want to admit that mistake. But at the same time, I don't know that we're going to be able to get a definitive answer. I do trust other folks that know this information. Like if they were able to say, hey, I knew someone that worked there and this car was, loaned out for the day, for, special dignitary, I totally get it. But what I want to show you is I read a lot about the Kennedy assassination. I've got many books, and I've just, it's been something since I was a kid that I've been fascinated with. Something to point out, you can go out and you can find video, and I have seen this, and this came from my memory. This is Parkland after the president's body was brought there, and this always stuck in my mind that this 64 was present there. One thing to note is if you look at the interior color of this car, it is black. Okay, so that ties into what these folks are saying in terms of, me providing information that didn't appear to be correct. We can also see that there is a hat sitting on the dash. We know this is a 64 because we can see the dash. We can see the antenna, of course, that was there up there in 63 as well. But basically the interior is the give here in these two images. Here's another image. You can see the hat here, and again, a 64. Also note, this is a skinnier white wall tire. And then there is some footage that I have found and seen over the course of time it's very tough to find color images from that day. But this car here appears to be blue, right? That's what I see. So that's what I always remembered. And what you see here is it's kind of hard to tell if that's a slim white wall. Yeah, I would say that's probably a slim white wall because you see the black between the cap and the white wall itself. So that's what we see there. Now, if we go back to here, this car here, we see it does have it has the wheel cover, then you've got the little black, so it's got the slimmer white wall. The rear door is cracked slightly, and we see the hat on the dash. We see the black interior. That is different than what we see in the LBJ car. So if we look here, we can see it also has the skinnier white wall, and it has the lighter interior. There are some other photos. There's one other one I wanted to hone in on. I think this is the one where you can see the white interior. I could have swore there was one showing maybe a thicker white wall, and I looked at so many of these photos for a while. Let me see if I can find this really quick. There's the slimmer white wall. And you guys could chime in. Yeah, here, it looked like, in this photo when I first saw it, it looked like this was a little bit thicker of a white wall, but I don't think it is, because you can see the line in there. But in this photo, again, you see the interior, to me, does look dark, but I think it's because the top is up, so I've kind of reinforced that. So if that is the case, what that tells us is, if these folks know their stuff, more than likely this isn't the LBJ Lincoln that was at Parkland. More than likely that's the same car that was at Parkland. We see the hat there. That's an indication. We see the same standard white wall tire that was on it as well. So that goes back to this article here, and it's certainly plausible that someone just had misinformation, and that's where I got this from. So you can kind of go through this. Now, this was interesting. I had read this like 4 or 5 times over and over again, trying to understand what Continental Comments was saying. They say in Continental Comments 152, second quarter 83, I pulled that issue, and there's not really any indication about what we're talking about here. It says there was an article on Lyndon Bain Johnson 64 convertible. At the time, this car belonged to the Museum of Transportation in San Antonio, Texas, and it was planned that the museum would have the car restored. They say, we do not know what happened to that car, and we do not believe it is the same car that Nick entered in the 99 Mid-America National Meet in Dallas. So when I read that over and over again, I kept saying, okay, well, maybe that's their indication of going, hey, we don't think it's the exact same car. Maybe the interior color gave it away. I'm not 100%. But you can look here. How did he acquire it? I kind of read through some of what I had, basically used for my source. The car is a very early 64, which is true. We have articles, yada, 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 where they talk about it's the car on the tarmac when they're putting Kennedy's coffin into Air Force One. I'm not 100% on it. I would say I'm about 95% sure it's not that car now. What do you guys think? Certainly that's not going to take, in my mind, anything away from this car, but I'm a type of person, I want to give out the right information. So what I don't want to do is spread misinformation. I don't want to say, yeah, that's that car. And folks are like, no, where did you get that information from? So you guys know now where I got the info from. What do you think? If you have any other information, maybe you grew up in this area, maybe your family had some lineage to Lincoln Mercury dealership, or maybe you're Bruce Stewart here who's going to maybe chime in with some more intel. I appreciate it. Let's get the story right. Good luck to the seller. I think this car is a very nice car. I think it deserves to be in a museum, if at all possible. And it sold for $172,000 a year and a half ago. Take care, everyone. Check out Lincoln Addict Podcast, however you find podcasts, and stay on the rise.